More than 1,000 missiles were fired at this aircraft. Not one of them ever hit. During the tensest decades of the Cold War, it flew directly over enemy territory in broad daylight, on purpose, daring them to try. And its escape plan, if a missile ever locked on, wasn't to dodge or to hide or to fire back. It was almost insulting in its simplicity. The pilot would simply push the throttle forward and fly away from the missile, faster than the weapon built to kill it. This is the story of the state, Route 71 Blackbird, an airplane so far ahead of its time that it set records in the 1970s that, in the year 2026, more than half a century later, still have not been broken. Not by any other plane, not by anyone. And the reason it was untouchable isn't really about speed. It's about what happens when you decide to be so far ahead of everyone else that competing with you stops being possible. Because that idea, being generations ahead instead of one step ahead, is the exact same principle that decides who wins today, in technology, in business, and very soon, in artificial intelligence. If you're the kind of person who wants to see where the world is actually heading before everyone else does, this is your channel. Subscribe, because this story is a masterclass in exactly that. The Blackbird cruised at over 3 times the speed of sound. Mach 3.2. That's more than 2,200 miles an hour. At that speed, if you fired a rifle bullet forward and the plane kept flying, in many cases the plane would arrive first. It flew so high, around 85,000 feet, that from the cockpit, pilots described seeing the curvature of the Earth, the sky above them turning black in the middle of the day, because they were flying at the very edge of space. To even survive up there, the 2 crew members had to wear full-pressure suits, the same kind of suits astronauts wore. If the canopy had failed at that altitude, their blood would have started to boil. This was not really an airplane in the way you think of one. It was a machine that lived on the border between the sky and outer space. In 1976, State Route 71 set the world record for the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft. Both records, in 1976. And as of today, in 2026, both of them still stand. Think about how insane that is for a second. The smartphone in your pocket is millions of times more powerful than the computers that ran the entire Apollo program. Cars, medicine, communication, everything has been reinvented 10 times over since the 70s. But the fastest plane a human has ever flown is still a design from an era of rotary telephones and no internet. Nothing built since has been able to beat it. That is not normal. That is what being decades ahead actually looks like. The Blackbird was born in a place at Lockheed with an almost mythical reputation, a secret division called the Skunk Works, led by a legendary engineer named Kelly Johnson. And the problem they were handed was, on paper, impossible. Build an aircraft that can fly across hostile territory to take photographs, and make it so that nothing the enemy has, no jet, no missile, can stop it. Most people, most companies, most engineers would attack a problem like that by improving what already exists. Take the fastest plane we have and make it 10% faster. That is how 99% of the world thinks. One step ahead. Kelly Johnson's team did the opposite. They didn't try to build a better version of an existing plane. They asked a completely different question. What would we have to invent, from nothing, to make this thing untouchable? And then they went and invented it. At Mach 3.2, the air friction against the plane's surface was so extreme that the outer skin heated to hundreds of degrees. Ordinary aluminum would have softened and failed. So they didn't use aluminum. They built almost the entire aircraft out of titanium. The United States did not have enough high-quality titanium of its own. The best source of the raw ore was the Soviet Union, the very country the plane was designed to spy on. So, through a web of front companies and third parties, the CIA quietly bought the titanium to build the plane. From the enemy, it was built to watch. Let that sink in. The plane heated up so much in flight that the entire airframe would physically grow by several inches as it got hot. So they designed it to be slightly loose on the ground. When the Blackbird sat on the runway, cold, its fuel tanks actually leaked, dripping onto the tarmac, because the panels were built to only seal tightly once the plane was in the air and the metal had expanded to fit. A plane that was designed to leak fuel while parked, because the engineers were thinking about a reality most people never even considered. That is what it looks like to design for a level nobody else is operating at. The Blackbird was painted black, and that black paint is where the name comes from. But it wasn't for looks. The special paint helped radiate away some of that tremendous heat, and it helped scatter radar. This aircraft was one of the earliest serious attempts at what we now call stealth. In the 1960s, Kelly Johnson ran the Skunk works on a set of rules still quoted by engineers today, built around small teams, radical trust, and cutting through bureaucracy to move fast. He didn't just build a plane. He built a way of solving impossible problems that companies still try to copy 60 years later. The untouchable results almost never come from big, slow, careful committees. They come from a small group given permission to try what everyone else called impossible. They were solving problems the rest of aviation wouldn't seriously face for another 20 or 30 years. Now put all of that together, and you understand why it was untouchable. Because the enemy's entire defense system was built around a set of assumptions. Planes fly at a certain altitude. Planes fly at a certain speed. Missiles are designed to intercept things flying within those normal limits. The Blackbird simply refused to live inside those limits. Over its entire career, despite flying over some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, more than 1,000 surface-to-air missiles were fired at Blackbirds. Not a single one ever brought one down. No State Route 71 was ever lost to an enemy. It once flew from Los Angeles to Washington in about 64 minutes, a trip that takes an airliner around 5 hours. It crossed from New York to London in under 2 hours. These are not just numbers. They are proof that the thing was operating on a level the rest of the world simply had not reached yet, and in many ways still hasn't. The standard procedure, if a missile launch was detected, was written down in the manual almost casually. Accelerate. Just speed up, climb, and leave the missile behind. The weapon designed to destroy it simply could not catch up. The Soviets tried to counter it with one of their best interceptors, the MiG-25 Foxbat. The Foxbat would climb as high as it could and get behind the Blackbird, closing to around 3 kilometers back. And there it would just sit, unable to close the final gap, unable to climb any higher, watching this thing cruise away from it, out of reach, every single time. 3 kilometers behind the future and no way to catch up. If you want a single image for what it means to be a generation ahead of your competition, that's it. There's a famous story about a routine radio call. Down low, a small Cessna asked air traffic control for a ground speed check. Then a twin engine, then a fighter jet, a little smugly. And then, from the very edge of space, the Blackbird crew calmly keyed the mic and asked for their ground speed. The controller paused and answered, 1,842 knots. Nobody else on that frequency said another word. So why did such a perfect machine ever stop flying? And the answer is the twist, and it's the most important part of the whole story. The Blackbird was not shot down. It was not outflown. It was retired in the 1990s because of two things. It was extraordinarily expensive to operate, and satellites in orbit, and later drones, could gather a lot of the same intelligence without risking a human crew. In other words, the Blackbird wasn't beaten by a better plane. It was made unnecessary by an entirely different kind of technology. The competition didn't catch up to it in the air. They changed the game so that the race in the air didn't matter as much anymore. And that, right there, is the lesson that reaches all the way into today. Because being decades ahead in one specific thing is incredibly powerful, but it is not permanent. Everyone is racing to be the fastest, the biggest, the most advanced at the current game. And the State Route 71 is a 70-year-old warning that says, yes, be far ahead. But never fall so in love with your lane that you miss the moment someone changes the entire race. First, A small improvement on what exists is a completely different strategy from inventing something the future can't beat. Second, when you operate at a level above everyone else's assumptions, their tools to stop you simply don't apply. And third, the hardest one. Even a perfect edge in one thing can be made irrelevant by a change in the game itself. The engineers who built it in the 60s are mostly gone now. The planes themselves sit in museums, still looking like they landed from the future. But the record still stands. More than 50 years later, the fastest a human has ever flown is still them. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to read your answer in the comments. In your own life, in your work, are you trying to be one step ahead of the people around you? Or are you trying to be a generation ahead, so far out that catching you isn't even the conversation? Be honest. Those are two completely different games. And if you want more stories like this, where the technology of the past quietly explains the future we're all walking into, subscribe and stay with me. Because the edge was never about being a little bit better than the person next to you. It was about seeing the thing everyone else will only understand years too late. I'll see you in the next one.